Hi, folks. Welcome back to Ken Michaels Radio. Here on my channel, as you know, I interview a lot of people and talk about the Beatles, the group, the solo years, whatever comes to mind. My special guest this time out is John Borack, and that's a name you might be familiar with for a number of reasons. He's the contributing editor, a contributing editor for GOLDMINE magazine. He also authored a book on John Lennon called Life is What Happens, which came out in 2010. He's also written a couple of books on power pop music. Shake Some Action, The Ultimate Power Pop Guide, that was in 2008, and Shake Some Action 2.0, a guide to the 200 greatest power pop albums from 1970 to 2017. We should do a whole other show with him just on power pop music. But for right now, he's with us because he has this new book out, which is called The Beatles 100 Pivotal Moments in Beatle History. Okay, let's do it together. In stereo here. Okay, left channel, right channel. Oh, and backwards here. In true Beatle fashion. John, welcome to my YouTube channel.
Thanks so much, Ken. Great to be here.
Let's talk about your book, and the title kind of says everything, 100 Pivotal Moments in Beatle History. What gave you the idea to do this kind of book and in this particular format?
Well, as you know, there have been a plethora of Beatles books over the years, and covering the group from every conceivable angle, but I thought this was one that really hadn't been done, covering the Beatles as a group and also through their solo years in terms of what are those 100 most important moments in their career, those pivotal moments. And I ranked them from 1 to 100. Now, of course, that list would be different for everyone. It might be different for me if I were to do it again today. But, you know, people always like lists. They agree with them, they disagree with them, they spark conversation. So I just thought it would be a fun way to approach the Beatles and their music, again, both as a group and solo.
Yeah, this is a world of lists these days. And in fact, right here on my channel, I have two particular specialty shows that are all revolving around lists, a number 9 dream show and a 5 show, which we should have you on for, as a matter of fact. But one of the things that I liked about it, and I wasn't quite sure if you placed it in order from 100 to 1, I just thought they might just be, these are your 100 most pivotal. But and I like the fact that it's not all chronological. You can mix up anything from any year. But was it difficult coming up with 100 for you? Did you have to narrow it down, maybe?
I actually did have to pare it down. There are some solo albums, for example, that weren't covered, so you won't find anything about Ringo the Fourth in here, for example, or Driving Rain, which is probably my least favorite Paul McCartney record. You won't find those listed in here as one of the 100 pivotal moments in their career. So I did have to narrow it down. There's so much that's happened, as you know, not only while the group was together, not only while their solo careers were flourishing, but with all the reissues and all the things that have happened after the group broke up, like the Love Show and all the different relationships they've gone through, and just so much that's happened. I did have to narrow it down to 100, believe it or not.
Yeah. How do you weigh it down when you're mixing the actual works, the creative works of the Beatles, with their personal lives? Like, how do you compare John meeting Yoko for the first time with Double Fantasy? How do you rank them that way? That's got to be somewhat difficult.
Well, it was and it wasn't. It's all subjective, of course, like any list is. If you were to ask me today, where did you rank John and Yoko meeting? I think the first interview I did for this book, I said I ranked it number 2. And I looked at the book and I realized I didn't. I had ranked that number 10. So, sometimes things will change from day to day. But, it really is subjective. But it was basically me thinking, okay, how important is this? Was this event or record more important in the overall story than this other event or record? And that's pretty much the tact that I took while compiling the book.
And not only that, but when you're dealing with John and Yoko or Paul and Linda, you're not just talking about a marriage, you're talking about people that were an influence on them creatively and were part of their own work anyway.
Right. And that's why, John meeting Yoko is ranked so high in this book, because it did really affect John's music from that point onward. And of course, it affected what ended up happening with the group and their dynamic, as did Paul meeting Linda and marrying Linda. So, it was interesting to sort of going through everything, putting it together, and just thinking in my own head, okay, is this more important than this? I wonder if I should rank this here and here. And I changed the rankings on almost a daily basis. It was kind of like a billboard chart in my head going, back and forth from day to day until I finally put it together. And like I said, like any list, if I were to look at this now and re-rank them, it might be a bit different. But, I'm pretty happy with the way I ranked them here.
Yeah. Now, what you chose as the number one most pivotal moment is, to me, something that's so obvious. There can be no dispute. That being when John and Paul first met each other.
Right.
Even though to me it's the most obvious question to ask, why do you rank that number one?
Well, there would be no Beatles if, John hadn't met Paul on that particular day in Wilton. Everything kind of stems from that meeting in 1957. And that had to be number one. There was obviously so much that happened after that, but none of that would have occurred if those two had not met each other and started that creative partnership.
Yeah. One thing that I'm curious about, just to play devil's advocate here, before there was John and Paul, there was Paul and George. I mean, they had been friends before that, so there would be no Beatles, in my opinion, without the four that became the Beatles. So I didn't see that listed.
No, I didn't think that was as important as the John and Paul meeting. I'm not sure if there would have been a Beatles with just, John, George, and Pete Best. Or John, George, and even if Paul, George, and even if Ringo had joined later. All four of them had to be there, but that creative partnership, as I mentioned, of John and Paul, everything just sort of stemmed from that, and that's why I ranked that number one.
True. Although you can make the point that without Paul joining the group, you wouldn't have had George in the group. So
True. But honestly, and I may get raked over the coals for this, but I think you could have had the Beatles without George. It wouldn't have been the same. It would have been a bit different. But I don't think you could have had the Beatles as they were without John and Paul. So there you go.
Kind of you actually, the end
of that cards
chapter,
and letters coming in, folks.
And by the way, I should point out to everybody watching this that this is a very easy read, this book. Every single chapter, all 100 chapters are about 2 to 4 pages long, and that's it. But at the end of that chapter, chapter 1 here, there is an actual quote from John, which a lot of people might find to be really shocking, where he said that, not these exact words, but with him and Paul, they would have formed a great group together. I'm not so sure that George and Ringo, with 2 other guys, would have had a successful band.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I was saying earlier. It all stems from Lennon and McCartney, whether it's the songs, whether it's the push and pull of the group dynamic with, John being the cynic and Paul being the optimist, and even their personal conflicts that occurred later on, and the fact that they were constantly trying to one up each other, from 64 through 68. I think everything just kind of flowed from those two meetings. And yeah, maybe they could have had the Beatles without George and Ringo, as John said, but it wouldn't have been the same. I could go on for days about Ringo's drumming and why he's the perfect drummer for the Beatles, but I'm sure most of your viewers would agree with me, so we'll let that go unspoken for now.
Yeah. Well, you always hear about, they were the four sides of the square, as Paul has said it. So they all had a purpose, and it went beyond the music. So some people would say that none of them you could take out of the band and wouldn't be the Beatles. So it depends on how you look at it.
Sure. And we'll never really know, but all we can do is just be thankful that they did all meet each other, and that Ringo joined up in 1962, because when he did, the band went from here to here.
Hmm.
Just in terms of musicianship, in terms of personality, in terms of the overall vibe. That just sort of sent them on their way, I think.
And on that same note, one of the pivotal moments very early on, you mentioned, is the sacking of Pete Best with Ringo replacing him.
Yes.
So obviously it's debatable. We don't know what Pete Best was capable of beyond what he did in his early years. You don't know if he would have been innovative in any way. We only know how he is now, and he's very much kind of the same drummer when I've seen
Right.
him in concert as he was back then.
Yeah, and I think he would have remained the same drummer. Very consistent, very rock solid on that 4/4 beat, but really, I don't know if he was unable or unwilling to do much else, or if he thought that's what the music called for. But if you listen to some of the Decca tapes or some of the early
Mm.
Beatles live stuff with Pete on it, and you listen to songs he was playing that Ringo later recorded or played on with the Beatles, there's a world of difference. Ringo just has that nuance and creativity that Pete, for whatever reason, didn't display, at least on any of the recorded material that he appeared on. Pete is a very solid drummer and a great gentleman, but just not of the caliber of Ringo Starr.
Mm. And you can certainly hear those nuances early on. And as you point out in your book, in the Beatles anthology on the album, that version of Love Me Do from June of 1962, he does
Yeah.
not keep a consistent beat.
No, he's sort of all over the place, and Ringo has always been rock solid in terms of keeping the beat and timing. One of my favorite stories, and I'm not sure if I mentioned this in the book or not, was Ringo talking about recording "Free as a Bird" and "Real Love" for the Beatles anthology series, and Jeff Lynne kind of pestering him to use a click track. And Ringo said he told Jeff Lynne, "I am the bleeping click." and it's true. He was rock solid. A lot of records you listen to that were made in the 60s, 70s, even up to the early 80s, the timing is all over the place with the drums. It speeds up, it slows down. Ringo rarely, if ever, did that. I think it was John who said once, you got Ringo on a beat and you couldn't have dragged him off that with a crane. He was just so solid and right there all the time.
Agreed. You also mentioned the Beatles' arrival in America as being a pivotal moment. To me, these are all obvious, but
Sure.
ranking right up there, I think that was number two for you, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that's what sort of sent the whole thing into orbit, right? I mean, without the Beatles conquering America, America certainly would have been different. The Beatles' career certainly would have been different, and it opened up a lot of doors for them, musically and creatively,
Hmm.
and it was just a really special time, and it was an event, and as a lot of people have said, it was something America really needed after Kennedy being assassinated just a few short months before that. The country was still in mourning over the loss of the president, but the Beatles sort of injected a newfound sense of fun and excitement and joy to the entire country, and it obviously helped their career take off into the stratosphere as well. So a very, very important, if obvious, number two.
Yeah. The only thing that I would question you about on this is that obviously it opened up so many doors breaking in America, but they also made headway in Canada. I mean, they had All My Lovin', as a number one single there, and I think you even
Mhm.
said in your book in Australia too. So they could have, been very successful in other countries, and yet it still required them to make it big in the US for them to become the phenomenon that they were.
Right. That was the moment, and I think all four of them said that at one point where they hit number one in America. Uh, that was when they knew, obviously they were already huge in England and other parts of the world, but when America accepted them in 1964, that's where they went from a very, very popular beat music group to a worldwide phenomenon.
Hmm. Yeah, we're gonna bounce around a lot as
Mhm.
far as all these pivotal moments. Um,
I hope I
and
remember what I wrote.
I enjoyed the chapter on With the Beatles, where you referred to it as no sophomore jinx. You talk about the superior quality of the Lennon and McCartney originals, that they were better than on Please Please Me. You call certain songs "Hold Me Tight" and "Little Child" as being underrated. Why do you feel that way?
Well, there's some songs. Well, with the Beatles, there's probably no such thing as a deep cut anymore because all their fans have heard these songs over and over. But for the general public, those two songs are kind of deeper cuts and ones you don't hear as often on the radio or hear people talk about as often. But just really great, thrilling examples of their sound at the time, and the harmonies on both are wonderful as always, and the energy in particular on both of those songs was just kind of off the charts. And I don't think the Beatles maybe took those songs as seriously because there are a
Mm,
few flubs on "Hold Me Tight," which you can hear, where I think might be John and Paul are singing different words during one of the harmony sections, and they just probably figured, screw it, we'll just leave it in. It's fine. It's not a single. It's just an album cut. But just the overall energy and the melodic thrust of those songs, they're really wonderful. And maybe it's because I don't hear them as often, like I said, on the radio as other songs, that they're not old hat to me. But I just think they're really great songs, very underrated.
mm. Well, I've often said Beatles songs go from good to great. I don't
Yeah,
really consider there to be clunkers in there, although a lot of people will argue with that point.
yeah.
Um, It Won't Be Long had hit record written all over it, which I agree with. I could say that about so many Beatles songs, but you definitely
Oh
feel
yeah.
that way.
I mean, in an era when so many groups were filling up their records with just pedestrian sort of, you know, rehashes of songs they had already done, or really just sort of weak sounding covers. The Beatles were recording the covers that they had been doing live for years, so they had them down. They weren't obvious ones. They were, some that were maybe a little less well known than
Hmm.
others. And yeah, and the originals of that era were just very powerful. And It Won't Be Long, in particular, just the vocal interplay between John and Paul on there when they do the yeah, yeah, higher
Hmm.
and lower. It's just amazing, and it blows me away to think that was not a single, because it certainly could have been a hit, I think.
Oh, I agree with you. Great lead off track. And
Mhm.
thing is, here in the United States, it was such an amazing time that first half of 1964, and we were playing catch up with the Beatles' earlier stuff, and we would have "Love Me Do" on the charts at the same time as we had "She Loves You" and "I Want to Hold Your Hand" and "Do You Want to Know a Secret?" And they were all, you know, in the top 10, and they were all doing well. There were only so many singles you could release at the same time.
Right.
But yeah, and then you hear the story about in the UK that they made the singles and the album separate entities, which was only partly true. But yeah, It Won't Be Long could have been a number one hit as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I definitely agree. It's one of my favorite Beatles songs.
I also feel that way about Any Time at All, which John thought was a
Yeah,
rewrite of It Won't Be Long.
it's sort of similar, but that's another one of my favorites, and it does have that same kind of energy, and the drumming on that particular track Ringo's drumming is amazing. There's some nuances and some different ways that he sort of changes things up in different verses, and it's pretty cool to listen to. But so many of those early tracks just jump out of the speakers, and those two in particular still do that for me.
Mm. You do say here that all I've got to do, you write, it's not much of a stretch to consider this tune a precursor to the Zombies Tell Her No. I'm trying to hear that in my head. I love the zombie song, but how do you hear a similarity there?
It's not really the melody, it's more the kind of start and stop sort of vibe. And I could sing it to you, but then your viewers would all go somewhere else. So I won't do that. But it's the sort of and of the Zombies song, and then the Beatles song kind of has that same start and stop vibe to it. I think the Zombies obviously heard that song and maybe took it a little bit further, or did something a little different with it. Just
Okay.
the way it sounded in my head.
Okay. Interesting. No, now I'm hearing what you're hearing. So, you say Devil in Her Heart is obscure, but great. And I'll agree with you.
It is, yeah. I think the Donays were the ones
Donays.
who did the original. The Donays, yes. And I never heard about that song being played on the radio here in Southern California. I had never heard of the track. A lot of these tracks, I'm sure when people heard them in 63, 64, I'm sure they thought those were Beatles originals if they didn't look at the record label, because a lot of folks probably had never heard these songs before. Twist and Shout, maybe. You Really Got a Hold on Me, which is another great track from With the Beatles. Maybe. But things like Devil in Her Heart, I don't think a lot of people, at least a lot of people who were the Beatles audience, would have heard that one. So it probably seemed like a Beatles composition to them. But yeah, that's a really good one. Really good one.
As Paul has said, the Beatles prided themselves in picking obscure material that other bands weren't covering, so that they would have different material.
Right.
So, and
right.
that's a great
and they were
example.
listening to, they were of course listening to Chuck Berry and Buddy Holly and Little Richard, and they covered all those. But they were also listening to people like James Ray. And I was just watching McCartney 321 the other day, and he mentioned, I think the song was called "If You Got to Make a Fool of Somebody,"
Right.
which was on the James Ray album, that they would cover that when they were playing in Liverpool and Hamburg. They never recorded it, but obviously George had picked up that record because Got My Mind Set on You, as you know, from his 87 album, Cloud 9. That was a James Ray song from that same album.
Right.
The song Paul had mentioned was on. So they were listening to everything they could get their hands on from America, particularly soul, and what now qualifies as sort of vintage classic rock, Chuck Berry, Elvis, and Little Richard. So the influences were all kind of soaked up, and then they took that music and sort of molded it into their own.
Sure. And apparently they weren't the only ones that knew that song, If You Got to Make a Fool of Somebody, because Freddie and the Dreamers had a single with it, which went top 40 here.
Yeah. A lot of the bands would play the same songs, live. And so the Beatles were constantly looking for songs that other people maybe hadn't heard before, hadn't played, because as Paul has mentioned, the last thing you'd want to do is be on a bill, have your set list, and then the band before you plays a few of the songs that you were going to play, because they've heard them too. So they were constantly sort of ferreting out those more little known tracks.
I'm wondering how unique it must have been for a band like the Beatles to also do show music, like Till There Was You or A Taste of Honey, because a number of other British acts would follow that after the Beatles did it. Like Jerry and the Pacemakers did You'll Never Walk Alone, that kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. And that was sort of after the Beatles saw some success with it. That was part of their influence. And, I think that was mainly Paul who wanted to do those songs. That was sort of his niche, as it were. He loved old show tunes. Later on, he would write his own songs that sounded like they could have been old show tunes, Honey Pie from the White Album.
Right.
Sounds like something that, Al Jolson could have sang in the 20s or something, but,
You gave me the answer.
right.
Yeah.
There's tons of those. And, Paul loved doing them. But, that's another thing that helped make them a little unique. No one else, no other beat group in 1962 was going to do Till There Was You. They weren't going to do a song from the Music Man. But that was, another way that the Beatles sort of led the way.
I'm very happy to say that when I talk to fans these days, whereas the later stuff always gets so much credit as being their best work, every now and then there'll be a fan that'll say, oh, but A Hard Day's Night was one of their best albums. And they always point out of their early stuff, that particular album. Why do you suppose it's so? Because you do list that as being a pivotal moment, that album.
Yeah, well, that's kind of a personal thing for me. That's probably my favorite Beatles record, the UK version of Hard Day's Night.
Over the later stuff?
I actually would rank that as my number one Beatles record.
Huh.
And that's a surprise to a lot of people. Of course, I love Revolver. I love the White Album. I love them all. But as far as a personal favorite, and that's not saying it's the best or the greatest or whatever, it's just my personal favorite. That album sort of has everything. It was the first Beatles record where they were all original compositions. There were no covers on that one, and very nearly, as I mentioned in the book, it was very nearly a John Lennon solo record. 10 of the 13 tracks, I think, were composed mainly or completely by John. And a lot of those tracks are just some of the greatest ones and that they've ever recorded. Of course, the title track everyone knows, I Should Have Known Better, is a great one. And I Love Her is, a wonderful ballad by Paul. If I Fell has that great harmony, vocal harmony throughout. And there's also some tracks that are a little less, or not as well known, Anytime at All. We mentioned that earlier. One of my favorite tracks on the record is Tell Me Why, which I think features just some of Ringo's best drumming ever. I mean, if you listen to that track and really listen closely to Ringo's drumming, it's amazing. And it's something that is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to duplicate. The fills that open the track, the little build going out of the bridge, incredible, and just a really powerful, thrilling track. So yeah, that's I think overall a great record, and certainly my favorite Beatles album.
Yeah, well, to me, it's got so much energy throughout the entire album. And when you're talking about two songs that slow it down as ballads, If I Fell and then I Love Her, those are two of their greatest love songs. So there's no argument for me there. But I do want to question the title track, A Hard Day's Night, because as you know, Walter Shenson asked them to write the song and they came back the next day. We don't know if it's all John or even mainly John. It's always been my impression that the part that Paul sang, that he wrote that part, but we don't know for sure percentage wise how much John wrote and how much Paul wrote.
Right. Yeah. And there's no way to ever know. And even when Paul does interviews these days, there's something like, McCartney 3-2-1, his memory isn't what it used to be. And who is when they're that age? But even when he was younger, I don't know, it just seemed like he would make errors in terms of when songs were recorded or whatnot. He talked about a Revolver song, I think.
Here, There, and Everywhere.
Yeah, and talked about it being recorded during the Rubber Soul sessions or something like that. So that's going to happen, and yeah, we'll never really know how much any one of them wrote of any particular song. There have been some songs where John has said it was completely him, and then Paul has come back and said, "No, I wrote this part, I wrote that part," and John's not around to.
Yeah, but it's pretty remarkable when you think about it. They wrote so much material and recorded so much material in a very short period of time. It's really difficult to remember everything about every session. But the thing is, when it comes to the songwriting, there isn't between the two of them what John and Paul said, too many disputes there, other than In My Life and Eleanor Rigby, and maybe a little bit about Norwegian Wood.
Right.
So that is in and of itself remarkable. And yes, Paul's memory is not 100% there, but I'd rather hear him tell the story since he was one of
Oh,
them that
sure.
wrote it.
Sure. No, it's anytime he, any interview, whether it's in print or radio or television or whatever, I'll watch it, I'll read it, I'll listen to it, because while he tells a lot of the same stories over and over in a lot of these interviews, there's always little nuggets in there that he'll throw out that maybe you haven't heard before.
Right.
And that's what keeps it interesting to me. And yeah, like you said, there's no one else can tell the story now except for Paul and Ringo. So it's fascinating to hear them no matter what they're talking about.
And when you're talking about Lennon McCartney songs, Ringo really can't talk about them since he wasn't really there when it was written. It was
No,
either
and
the
right,
two of them or
right,
one of them alone. So
right. And then
anytime,
you really can't talk to Ringo about anything from 1976 to 1980 because he doesn't really remember much of that period at all.
hmm,
Just due to some of his excesses. He's mentioned that there's complete years that are lost to him. He doesn't even remember them happening.
yeah. But
So,
unfortunately, I think there's a lot of fans out there that feel like they've read everything, they know everything, and if Paul comes out with something that's entirely new that no one's ever heard before, or takes credit for something that fans aren't used to, then he's accused of revisionism. So I have a feeling, just to finish this thought, whatever he does in concert, if it's a Lennon McCartney song that people associate as John songs, he had something to do with it. Like he did The Word in concert in Europe
mhm.
a while ago. And you don't necessarily think of Paul for that song, but maybe he had a lot to do with the composition of that song. And Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite is one that he pulled out. And at the time, he said he remembered pulling the words off the circus poster with John. So these are things we hadn't heard before. And then fans get upset, you try to get credit for something that we never knew about now, so many years later. But,
Right,
who's
right.
he
Well,
going to believe?
and yeah, and sometimes even the two of have, like we discussed, have contradicted each other in interviews, saying, "Oh, I wrote that. No, I wrote that. I did this all by myself. No, I helped him with that." There's some songs. I remember when Lennon did his interview with Playboy in 1980. Might have been "Cry Baby Cry" or one of the songs from the White Album. He did not even remember writing it. He said, "I don't remember that song. I think it might be Paul's." And it was one that he had written. He
Yeah.
just didn't. It wasn't, obviously it wasn't important to him, and he didn't remember doing it. So there's that as well. That it's I can't remember what I was doing any given week 50 years ago. I'm not sure why these guys would be expected to remember everything, even though it's been fairly well documented. There's still holes there that we can still learn more about.
Hmm.
About a lot of this stuff. What I tried to do with the Beatles 100, I tried to use a lot of quotes, so we were getting it directly from their mouths, as it were. I didn't want to rehash the same old stories, so I kind of searched deeper for some of the quotes, and a lot of stuff that hadn't been previously used to death anyway.
Hmm.
And it interjected a lot of my opinion as well. So I think that's what makes this a little bit different from a lot of the books that have already been out there.
Yeah, I like that quote in particular about George Harrison that John said in your chapter on All Things Must Pass that he's had songs since 1920.
Right. And there's the more, well, it's a little bit more well known, the quote where John said, disparagingly, that George looked like an asthmatic Leon Russell on the cover of All Things Must Pass. And it's like, oh man, that's but that was John during that era. Everything sucked. Everything was horrible. The Beatles were horrible. The whole experience was horrible. And now he's free. But then 4 years later, he was apologizing to George Martin and other people for things he had said during that time. So people
Well,
change, things change.
yep, opinions change, but I still believe that what he said in the moment is how he really felt. So It still has
Yeah,
value.
what he said at the moment was how he felt at that moment, and that was John. As you know, he would say whatever came to his mind. He didn't hold back, but he might feel something one moment, and then 2 years later, he might feel completely differently about the same subject, and that was part of who he was.
Yep. It's part of being human for a lot of us. So
Sure.
I really like the chapter on the Beatles being introduced to Bob Dylan. And since you mentioned quotes, I wasn't familiar with these couple of quotes that I want to read here. This is Paul talking about Dylan. He said, Dylan's Woody Guthrie period was very nice and I liked him then. But then he had a second wave of popularity when he became more psychedelic and more associated with drugs. And at that time, John particularly became very enamored of him because of his poetry. Masses of cluttered lyrics like John had written in his books. So Dylan's gobbledygook and his cluttered poetry were very appealing, and it hit a chord in John. It was as if John felt that should have been me.
Yeah. Yeah. That's an example of a quote you don't hear very often, but I think that says a lot about how John felt about Dylan. And later, of course, he would vilify him when Dylan turned to Christianity, and John recorded the parody
Serve
yourself
Serve yourself.
serve yourself as a answer to you got to serve somebody, the Dylan song. But at that time, Dylan was a hero to all the Beatles, but particularly John. And later, of course, he would become great friends with George and appear at the concert for Bangladesh. And George would record his songs. One of my favorite George tracks, as a matter of fact, and I think there's a version on the new All Things Must Pass box set, but it didn't come out officially till '85, I believe, was I Don't Want to Do It, which is just a great tune, very underrated George solo track that too few people have heard. I think it was a single, I think, on Columbia Records here in the US.
From Porky's Revenge, the soundtrack.
The cinematic classic, yes.
And Dave Edmunds produced it.
All right. No, the album, the soundtrack album had some great stuff on it. But very underrated George track, and it's an example of how much he loved Dylan and Dylan's poetry and music. John was when John latched onto something back in those days, he really latched onto it, like LSD, for example, and Yoko Ono, and other things, I'm sure. But he latched on to Dylan that same way, and of course Dylan influenced him greatly. So you've got to hide the love away.
And even I think I'm a Loser was influenced by Dylan.
Yeah, I think just sort of the whole truth telling. Let's be upfront. Let's be honest. I'm going to write about myself as opposed to I love you, you love me, please me, love me do. I'm going to write about myself. And then, of course, he took I'm a Loser one step further and wrote Help, which was kind of in that similar vein. So that's when his writing started getting more and more personal, as opposed to the kind of short stories that Paul was writing. For example, Lovely Rita from Sgt. Pepper, that was completely made up at least for the most part. I think he had met a meter maid, but it was for the most part complete fabrication. But that's the kind of stuff that Paul could sort of write in his sleep, whereas John's writing was always more personal and to the point.
Introspective.
Yeah.
Another quote here in that same chapter I loved was what Bob Dylan said on George Harrison. He said George had an uncanny ability to just play chords that didn't seem to be connected in any kind of way and come up with a melody and a song. And I understand that. I mean, you have a musical background, chords, a lot of George's chord progressions are so different from other musicians, and somehow his melodies make sense with these odd progressions.
Yeah, they're not the typical sort of chord progressions, and it's what always made George sort of unique, particularly as it got to around 1968 and later, which is sort of when he really came into his own songwriting wise. You could really hear, stuff wasn't always linear. There were always different things going on that kind of were, interesting. The bridge to something, for example,
Hmm.
very, very different from the rest of the song. The dynamics go up quite a bit and then back down during the guitar solo. And yeah, George was a great writer, and of course underrated in the sense that he was up against two of the greatest pop songwriters ever when he was with the Beatles. But I think a lot of his material has stood the test of time, and has gotten even greater in the eyes of the fans and of listeners as time has gone by. I know myself, a lot of people always speak of Something and Here Comes the Sun as his two high points in the Beatles, which I can't really argue with that because they're both wonderful songs. But the more I listen to songs like Long, Long, Long and Savoy Truffle from the White Album, I enjoy the heck out of both of those tunes. And, they're really, really excellent. And two of my favorites, honestly, on the White Album.
Hey, listen, no argument from me. I mean, I love Don't Bother Me. So
yeah, which George always hated, but first song you ever wrote, if you can write that one, that's pretty darn good.
that's a really good start. You had a chapter on what you call the fractious Let It Be sessions with this new film about to come out with Peter Jackson, in which we're probably going to get to see that other side of Let It Be, the more joyous sessions. I don't know how balanced the look it's going to be, but how do you look at those sessions now? Do you think that maybe we've been misled, that it was, more misery for like when I watch Let It Be, the movie now, I don't see it as being all that depressing a film. I just look at it as a band, what most bands go through.
It was really poorly shot and poorly edited, I think. It looked sort of drab, even at the time. And so I think that kind of led to the whole vibe of it being seen as depressing. It wasn't the upbeat Beatles of A Hard Day's Night and Help. It was the older Beatles who were not, jumping around and being crazy, and they were arguing a little bit. And Paul was trying to take control over not only his songs, but everyone else's songs, from time to time. But, as far as the Peter Jackson film, I think we're definitely going to see a different look at the band. But, like with everything else, I think the truth lies somewhere in the middle. They probably weren't as miserable as Let It Be, the original cut, made it seem. And things probably weren't as hunky-dory as the new film is going to make it seem. The truth lies somewhere in the middle. You can do a lot of magic in the editing bay, and I think they were looking to make this a positive look at that era. And so then you could turn around and have people say, see, they weren't unhappy. They were always getting along, but they weren't. I mean, they were going in four different directions. Ringo was getting ready to start his acting career. He was honestly a little bored in the studio during Sgt. Pepper. That's been documented because there wasn't as much for him to do. He left the band during the White Album, so he was a little disenchanted. George obviously was disenchanted. He was, he had been going to America and hanging out with different musicians there and getting a lot more respect from them than he did from John and Paul.
Mm-hmm.
So there was that sort of anger at being treated like Paul's little brother during the sessions. And John was, of course, just off in his own world, Yoko and drugs and whatever else was going on in his life, and just wasn't as interested in the Beatles anymore. So yeah, there was some conflict going on, but obviously there's still some happy moments as well. The four of them were good friends, and even though you're arguing, that bond still remains, and I think that'll show during the new film too.
Yeah, well, a lot of people want things to be explained in black and white, and it just isn't that possible when it comes to the Beatles,
Right.
because you've got very different relationships going on between the four of them, and it is very complicated. And
Yeah,
if you think that George really wanted out, there are times when even after McCartney announced when the McCartney album came out about the end of the Beatles, not really saying definitely that there never will be Beatles again, not really committing to it, but certainly it was put out there as though the Beatles were over. And George is still talking about there may be another album. So
right, right. Yeah,
it's
John had mentioned that too after Abbey Road came out.
mhm,
When you would have thought, okay, the four of them know it's all over, that this is it. That was the swan song. We're done. John had said, I want a divorce, the famous words he uttered in the board meeting at Apple. But then there's a quote attributed to John where he talks about, after Abbey Road, he talks about the next album and 4 songs from Paul, 4 from John, 4 from George, and
mm,
2 from Ringo or something. And it's like, wow, he was talking about the next Beatles album on one hand, but on the other hand, he was talking about how he wanted a divorce and wanted to leave the group. So a mass of contradictions, obviously. And that's who they were. And that's what was going on at that time too. There's just a lot of things going on with them personally and professionally. You had the whole battle with Alan Klein and John Eastman, who's going to be the manager, and
mhm.
that certainly didn't help matters. And later in '69, so it was all kind of a mess at that
I know
point.
it's some people want to figure it all out and get into the minds of the Beatles, and it's not easy. There's no one clear-cut explanation of it all. It was
Right.
very, very complicated. Let's move on a little bit on some of the solo music. One of your chapters, John Lennon Bares His Soul on the Plastic Ono Band album. Obviously, it's looked at as being a masterpiece. Why do you consider this album to be so important?
Well, his first solo record after the breakup, and after going through the primal scream therapy with Yoko here in Los Angeles, the words "bearing his soul" that's what he did. The lyrics were raw, the music was raw, everything was just sort of pointed. It was not sugar coated at all. It was just sort of an in-your-face record, but brutally honest and brutally straightforward, and pretty much unlike anything popular music-wise that had come before. It was John setting the tone for a lot of singer-songwriters that were to come along later in the '70s, really, with stuff like Working Class Hero, and then kind of almost a lot of the songs are sort of precursors of punk rock. Honestly, if you look at stuff like Remember,
Mhm.
and tracks like that, pretty amazing achievement. I wouldn't call it John's greatest solo record. I know a lot of people do. Most people do. I prefer Imagine myself, which has that sugar coating, which John even admitted. Imagine his Plastic Ono Band with sugar on top. He knew it wasn't going to sell if he didn't have a little bit of that sugar, that fairy dust sprinkled on it. So he added, strings and horns and had Spector produce it. But yeah, Plastic Ono Band is a heck of an achievement, and stands as one of the Beatles' greatest solo records.
I was going
So
to ask you about what you just said about punk rock, that it was a precursor to punk rock. Certainly in the case of the fact that it's such a bare production, just guitars, drums, and well, half the album at piano. But what about all the stuff that came out of the '60s, all the garage band stuff, that where the production was not complicated at all, it was just a band as is, weren't those precursors?
yeah, you could consider those precursors as well. I think the difference with a lot of John's stuff on Plastic Ono Band was the anger,
Mm,
the lyrical anger, and a lot of that came through in the music. And I think a lot of the early punk bands, particularly in the UK, they probably listened to that record, and stuff like the Sex Pistols and the Clash. Early stuff was raw and it was angry, and I think that's a difference from the garage band tunes that you're speaking of. You know, a lot of those were certainly raw and not produced, you know, not lushly produced, but they were always sort of fun, you know. But you know, Plastic Ono Band was not a fun record. It was not an easy listen, and I think that's where the difference lies.
Okay. The Ringo album from 1973, you said was easily the pinnacle of Starr's solo career and a 5-star record to be sure.
Yeah.
Why do you feel that way?
Oh gosh. You know, he had all three of the Beatles working with them at different times. Songs from John, Paul, and George. Photograph is just one of the greatest singles of the 70s, I think. And, you know, something that, you know, one of George's greatest achievements with Ringo, and we'll never know how much of those songs Ringo actually wrote and how much George wrote, how much George was sort of helping his buddy. But I think George had a lot more to do with some of the solo Ringo stuff than George ever let on, or that Ringo ever will let on.
Well, if you're referring to It Don't Come Easy, I know Ringo has said that George wrote a verse and a bridge. So that's pretty exact what he's saying there. And there's no doubt about the fact that George produced it. He's got his guitar playing on it. He has his stamp all over it.
Oh yeah. Well, and then the backing vocals, which are, you know, brought down in the mix on Ringo's version, you can hear the singers singing Hare Krishna.
Right.
Obviously that's all George. But yeah. And even, you know, even back to Octopus's Garden, you can see them rehearsing it during Let It Be, and George kind of looking over Ringo. You almost think like he's going to pat him on the head saying, good boy, but that's good, but let's do this instead, you know. So I think he helped on that song as well, which is great. It just speaks to their friendship and the love that they had for each other. Well, but I think overall that there's a lot of stuff on the Ringo album that people don't really talk about as much. You know, of course, there are the hit singles. There's I'm the Greatest, which John wrote for Ringo. Because as John said, I never could have sang I'm the Greatest because people would have taken it so seriously. But there's a couple of other tracks that are worthy of special note. The band, or a lot of members of the band, appear on Sunshine Life for Me, which is a really cool kind of country hoedown sort of tune. Very, very fun. And I've always been a big fan of what I think is the most underrated track on the record, 6 O'Clock, which was a McCartney composition.
Yep.
And such a beautiful song. And I really, you know, somewhere there's got to be a demo of Paul, you know, singing that. I'd love to hear that. I don't know if it's ever surfaced, but just a wonderful song. And I think overall, just the upbeat party vibe of that record, the great songs, the fact that all three of the other Beatles were on there helping them, along with a lot of other really talented folks, you know, it all added up to a great record.
Yeah. Oh, I would not argue that this is a great album. It's just, I think that once Ringo cleaned up his act and he put out Time Takes Time in 1992, I think he was really putting a lot of effort behind his albums. And that album and the albums with Mark Hudson, for me, are represent the best, along with the Ringo album of his solo career. Yeah. And even after Mark Hudson, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Time Takes Time was a really good record. That was 92, I believe.
Yep.
And that's probably my second favorite Ringo album after the self-titled. A lot of great tracks on that one. And Ringo was really, you know, he was cleaned up, as you mentioned. He was really committed to the material. I think that's the one where he did Golden Blunders. Song was originally the Posies. Yeah, great version of that. And I loved reading an interview with Ken Stringfellow from the Posies saying, when we first heard Ringo was going to do one of our songs, we couldn't believe it because, you know, a Beatle is doing one of our songs. And you know, that was kind of a left field choice for him, but I think it really worked. And yeah, very successful record.
I wonder how he chose that song. I know Peter Asher produced that track, but I don't know how that song came to him.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, the Posies were on Geffen at the time, so maybe someone at the record company had heard the track somewhere and thought it would be a good one for him. But I don't know. I don't know. That would be an interesting question to ask.
Yeah. And I think the stuff after the Mark Hudson era has got him experimenting a lot more and writing with a lot of really strong songwriters. So, I think they're all worthwhile to listen to, but definitely, as much as I love the Ringo album from 73, I've got to put those other albums from the 90s in particular, Vertical Man and Ringo Rama and Choose Love, way up there with Time Takes Time and Ringo. So just my
Well,
opinion.
sure, sure. I thought his last EP, I know he has a new one coming out in a couple
Mm,
weeks, but the EP that came out earlier this year, I thought the bulk of that was really entertaining. I just actually posted a review of it on GOLDMINE magazine's website, where I have a column and different reviews up. And I thought that was a really solid record. I'm looking forward to hearing the new EP when it's released in a few weeks.
right. Yeah. Teach Me to Tango. Terrific song.
Yep.
Um, about
I'm not sure if
Paul.
that's my favorite, but
Yeah, I thought that was outstanding. Not Enough Love in the World is a great song.
that's a great one.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's Steve Lukather wrote that
Yeah.
with another guy from Toto. Um, Paul's first album is also a pivotal moment. Um, what are your thoughts on that one? Especially in this time, and you can comment on this when a lot of people are really appreciating early McCartney, more of that organic sound and DIY stuff from Paul. What are your thoughts about the McCartney album now, the first one?
Well, of course, it has two of his classics on there, undisputed classics, Every Night and Maybe I'm Amazed. Um, it does kind of feel like a cobbled together sort of thing because some of the tracks were older. He had demoed the song Teddy Boy with the Beatles during the Let It Be sessions, or he had at least brought it to the group and they had played it.
Mhm.
Some of the other tracks were, sounded maybe kind of unfinished, um, and some sort of instrumental fragments and whatnot. But overall, it's pretty entertaining still. And I would say there's no tracks that I skip, but that's only because I take it off before the last song on side two. So I'm not technically skipping a song, but I could live without
Karina
Green.
Croy?
Yeah, I could do without that one. But it was Paul kind of expressing himself where he was at the time. It was an organic record. Paul was just sort of living that free and easy lifestyle, and it's going to do it all myself. I'm here on the farm. I want to bring a microphone in the bathroom to get echo. I'm going to bring a microphone in the bathroom to get echo. I'm going to do whatever the heck I want. It was interesting to hear because a lot of people I think were expecting more at the time.
Hmm.
Because when you come right off of Abbey Road, it's sort of a shock to go to McCartney. It's not a straight line from one to the other. It's the sound is a lot different and the songs were a lot different. So I think people were expecting more from Paul at the time, and that's probably why it was so so savagely reviewed when it was originally released. But like anything else, and this is the case with Ram too, time has been very kind to the record. I think now in retrospect and in hindsight, people can see what Paul was trying to do and or not trying to do. And they can appreciate it a little bit more.
Hmm. On the subject of Ram, I should point out that earlier this year, you and I did an interview based on the fact that you wrote an article on your favorite albums of 1971.
Mhm.
And your number two album was Ram, and your number one album was Imagine. So on that
Yeah.
basis alone, because of your very good taste in music, I approached you so we could do an interview on that, which is on my website, and I'll give the link for that in the description box. But why do you suppose it is that all these years later, Ram is so respected? I mean, there are a lot of people now that are calling it his greatest album ever.
And I'm one of those people. I would agree. You know, a lot of people lean toward Band on the Run, but I've always been a Ram fan. Ram, and then Back to the Egg, which even fewer people like, I think. But I've always been a big fan of that record as well. But you know, pretty much all the McCartney solo stuff up through Tug of War, I'm a fan of. Not so much, you know, some of the records after that I'm not as fond of. Not a big fan of Press to Play. Not a big fan of at all of Driving Rain, which I mentioned earlier. Not a huge Pipes of Peace guy. Sounded like just leftovers from Tug of War to me for the most part. Although there are some, you know, some good tracks on there. But you know, I think Ram has kind of gained in stature over the years again because, you know, Paul wasn't trying to sound like the Beatles, but people wanted him to sound like the Beatles. And when he didn't sound like the Beatles at the time, that disappointed people. And when he was doing things like, you know, Smile Away or Monkberry Moon Delight, people were horrified, you know, at the time. Oh, he's just screwing around. He's not making any sense. He's da, da, da. But you know, now you know, look at those tracks with a little bit of hindsight, and you can appreciate different things about them that maybe weren't appreciated at the time. Like, I defy anybody else to try to sing Monkberry Moon Delight. That song is just, that's crazy. And just the fact that, you know, he's up, he's down, he's all over, it's just an amazing vocal performance.
I think
you
it's
know,
his
and
greatest vocal performance.
It very well could be.
Yeah.
I mean, and Smile Away, even though it's, you know, certainly goofy, it's a great song. You know, it's a lot of fun. And you know, there's some, you know, hidden or sort of hidden gems on there. Eat at Home, I think, is one of his coolest solo tracks. Was never released as a single here in the US, although it was in a few other countries overseas. But that's a great track, just sort of channels Buddy Holly a little bit. And
Sure.
And it's got a great vocal and some great backing vocals by Linda. And you know, a lot of people forget that album was credited to Paul and Linda McCartney. You know, how much she had to do with it, we'll never really know. But a lot of the songs were credited to her as a co-writer. And she does sort of provide that, you know, New York sort of girl groupie background vocal thing, as Paul has described it, to a lot of the songs. And, you know, it's not perfect, it's not polished, but it works. But I think the fact that it wasn't perfect and wasn't polished is what angered some people at the time, because again, they wanted to hear Abbey Road, they wanted to hear Sgt. Pepper, you know, and they weren't hearing that, you know, unless you went to Backseat of My Car at the end of Ram, and that was probably the closest that you'd get. But overall, it was still kind of a low-key record, and I don't think people were prepared for that at the time.
It's very interesting. It's interesting, your comments there, because, you know, we're living at a time when people want less slick production, you know, and part of the appeal of Ram is that. But at the same time, I've also heard people say it's very Beatle-y, that album. And you've got George Martin helping out on Uncle Albert Admiral Halsey with the arrangement, you know, with the brass and the orchestra for that, and on Backseat of My Car. You know, there are some polished songs, and Backseat has got a lot of edge to it too. But, you know, I can see both sides there. And vocally, it's a tour de force for Paul. You know, his vocals were amazing throughout the whole album. And it's kind of like, you talk about Monkberry Moon Delight, it's like, oh, darling, gone haywire. You know?
Right. Yeah, the vocals are just it's tough to describe. They're just so out of left field. The lyrics are completely out of left field, but you know, Paul's done that quite a bit during his solo career. You'll read the lyric sheet and you'll say, what the heck is he talking about? You know, why is he talking about, on example, on Getting Closer, Back to the Egg? What's my salamander? What are you doing, Paul? You know, but it works, you know, for whatever reason, It doesn't always work, but in some cases it does. And on Ram, it certainly did. But to speak to your point about Uncle Albert, that was, I think, the most Beatley song on the album. And when you look at it, if you wanted people who were sort of thirsting for Son of Abbey Road, that was sort of, similar. It was kind of a medley. So it was sort of similar a little bit to side 2 of Abbey Road. It had bits of little songs sewn together. It was orchestrated. And of course, that was the big hit from the record. So there you go.
Yeah. I could tell we have a very different opinion on Paul's music for his later stuff, because Press to Play is like, it is my second favorite McCartney album of all time. I like when Paul moved into the 80s, and I embrace when he works with producers who happen to be hot at the time and not being afraid to experiment with them. I think the producers play a very big part in shaping the sound of Paul's records, even though it's a co-production and Paul has the final say. I think the producers are a big influence on much of his music, whereas in the 70s, most of what he did, he produced himself, most of it.
Right. Well, I need to revisit Press to Play because a good friend of mine and I were discussing it the other day, and he's a huge Paul fan, as I am, and he keeps telling me how wrong I am about Press to Play. And so I've got to pull it out and revisit it again, because I think it's the anniversary of the album's release, or at least it was.
35th.
Yeah, God, hard to believe. But there's a few that I need to revisit, and that's one of them. I mean, I certainly enjoy a lot of the albums that came immediately after that. Flowers in the Dirt, I think, is very good. Very, very good. And about half of Off the Ground, I think, is excellent. Wine Dark Open Sea, I think, is one of his really underrated ballads and that's on Off the Ground.
Right.
And then a lot of stuff after that, of course, I enjoy quite a bit as well, all the way up to the latest stuff. But yeah, I guess I've got to listen again to Press to Play. All I remember is the single being played to death, and yeah, Press, and just really, really disliking the production, and not caring for the song that much. But I will give the album another chance, and I will report back.
Okay, that's all I could ask. But I do find, because I read a lot of what fans write in social media, so many Beatle fans are caught up in production, where I think sometimes the production matters more to them than the quality of the songs. But I do think Press to Play has become, it's a polarizing album among fans, because it represents a change in the sound and in the production of Paul's music. Those that want him to sound more like the Wings days or the Beatle days don't want to move into the 80s with synthesizers and drum machines and heavy drum sounds. And that wasn't on every single song, by the way, on Press to Play. But and it carries over to this day. Whenever Paul works with a new producer who he likes a lot, like Greg Kurstin, producing Adele, he must like his work for him to want to work with him. And then someone like Ryan Tedder, who sounds very modern, and a lot of his fans don't want that. They want the old Paul. So
right. Well, a lot of people like to look backward instead of looking forward. That's just, I think, how people are a lot of times in terms of music. When you have a back catalog as vast as the Beatles and Paul McCartney, you want more of the same. And Paul has always been one to sort of push the envelope. Look at The Fireman, for example. I mean, a lot of great songs on those records, but you rarely hear people talk about them. But yeah, people expect Paul to stand in one place, and when he works with a hot young producer, or a different producer, or a popular artist, the cynics will come out and say, "Oh, he's just working with them because they're popular." Well, no, he's working with them because he wants to work with them. He doesn't need to work with anybody who's popular. He's popular enough.
mm-hmm.
He could not work with these people and sell just as many records. He's not going to sell them to their audience anyway. It's not how it works. But people by and large just have that negative thought when it comes to Paul doing anything different. But
Well,
I never, going back to Press to Play, I never thought well, I guess originally I never thought the songs were as strong as some of the other records. But the production wouldn't ruin a record for me if the songs were great. To me, the number one thing has to be the songs. Production couldn't really ruin it, at least not production like you, Paddingham, did on Press to Play. It wouldn't ruin a record. It might make me enjoy it a little less, but it certainly would never ruin it.
good. I'm glad to hear you say that. Let's wrap things up and talk a little bit about George. All Things Must Pass, especially with the box set just coming out. How it shocked the world when it first came out that George had this avalanche of songs. Like John said, he wrote since 1920. And, it's still amazing for me to listen to. Living in the Material World is my favorite album from any artist. But you can't help but marvel at All Things Must Pass because you're not just dealing with, in my opinion, one great album. You've got two great albums of material, and it's solid throughout. So your thoughts about All Things Must Pass when it was initially released and how you feel about the album now?
Well, George delicately described it as musical diarrhea. I think that was his quote at the time, just kind of spewing out all these songs he'd had stored up. And a lot of them he had brought to the Beatles during the Let It Be sessions and Abbey Road sessions, only to have them ignored. But I think overall, it's his strongest batch of songs. Definitely some classics in there. I think What Is Life is probably his best solo tune. Just a great AM radio single that just sort of leapt out of the speakers then, and it still does now. And on the new iteration of All Things Must Pass, with the production cleaned up a little and the specterization sort of stripped away, you can hear guitar parts in there that you couldn't really hear on the original, or at least I couldn't hear them. And it sounds like a little bit of a different song or even a different take. But it just makes me enjoy the song even more. I just reviewed the record for the latest issue of GOLDMINE magazine, and listened to it again several times while I was doing that. And while the live jam stuff was, that could have been taken out. I'm not a fan. The album proper is pretty incredible. Just some great vocal performances, some very, very passionate. You could tell George was passionate about what he was doing at the time, that he was, that he had broken free and was now able to do what he wanted to do, how he wanted to do it, without any interference from anyone else. And it's a wonderful achievement. Very, very strong record then. And if anything, it's probably gained in stature a little bit now. And I don't know if that has to do with George no longer being with us, or the fact that because things tend to get built up a little after an artist passes. But I think in the case of All Things Must Pass is just because the songs are so across the board strong. It's just a really powerful record, great record, and one that'll stand as George's high point of his career, I think.
Mm-hmm. So are you a fan of what Phil Spector brought to the production, or are you much happier when it's brought down, like you said, with What Is Life?
It honestly depends on the track. On some tracks, the Spector touch works, and that goes back to the Beatles' Let It Be record too. I mean, when I heard Let It Be Naked and heard The Long and Winding Road, I thought, boy, I really like the Spector production touches a lot better. It really sort of suited the song. On My Sweet Lord, the Spector production touches sort of worked that wall of sound. On What Is Life, I think a little bit more, it was given a little bit more room to breathe on the current remix, so I like it better. the new version. So it really depends on the song, honestly.
Yeah. Well, I think people who follow my work know that I'm very pro Phil Spector. And I think that he
Mhm.
brought so much to the original mix of All Things Must Pass. And part of the reason why it was successful, while I will always say the songs come first, but the production that he and George worked on together, it wasn't just Phil Spector, is what worked at that time. And I think people need to respect that. I have nothing against remixes, and you know, they're the kind of thing that I have to go back to every now and then, and I might hear something different that I hadn't heard before. But when you're hearing guitar lines from George and What Is Life in the new mix, does that make it better if you hear something that you hadn't heard before? Because George overlooked it to begin with, and he felt that it should have been covered up at the time.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's the case where it's just different and it almost sounds like a new song or a different song. And obviously, we're not going to get any more new music from George, so maybe that's why it really hit me. But overall, I'm certainly not anti-Spector.
Hmm.
I think a lot of people are more anti-Spector now because of his personal life and things that occurred there, as opposed to his musical career. Um, but I think he brought a lot to the original All Things Must Pass. It was George's sort of grand sweeping statement. And if you want somebody to make something sound grand and sweeping, there's nobody like Phil Spector. I mean, he could do that. He did it on Long and Winding Road. He did it on Let It Be, the song Let It Be. He was the master at doing that. So I think he was the perfect producer at the time for that record. I like the new remix. I don't love it, but I like it because it brings out certain parts that I didn't hear before. So again, it's almost like hearing new music, which I
Yeah.
enjoy.
And I've sometimes said with All Things Must Pass that, I have that image of the photo of George with the stained glass window behind him as though he's in a cathedral or a church or something. And so many of the songs I feel should have reverb, as though if you were in a church and
Right.
George was going to perform them, this is what it would sound like. So yeah, it works on that level. And I hadn't really thought about Let It Be the song as much, but it's a gospel song. And it
Yep.
works as though if you were in a church hearing the Beatles do Let It Be, it would sound closer to that. And
Right.
yeah, I just think it worked on that level. These little
Yeah,
touches that,
definitely.
some people are just anti-reverb. They want everything as dry as possible. But those touches that were added were there for a reason.
Right. You want it to sound um, grand and huge and big. It was sort of the opposite of Plastic Ono Band. John wanted raw. He wanted biting. He wanted in your face. Well, George didn't want that. He wanted I don't know. It's sort of like sinking into a couch with a lot of really comfortable cushions around you. That's sort of the sound of All Things Must Pass. To me, it's very comforting. And Spector did a great job of putting that across, and no one could do that like him. And
Yeah.
so, for that record, he was the perfect producer. But like I said, hearing the remix, it's not as dry as I thought it was going to be. When I heard they stripped away all of the Spector elements, I was thinking, okay, it's not going to sound anything like the original, but it did. I mean, it didn't sound that far from the original record. It just a little bit less lush, for lack of a better term.
Hmm. The lead vocals are dry from George.
Yeah, yeah, and brought more to the forefront. And I find that in almost every remix that's done now of any Beatles or solo Beatles record, it seems like the vocals are more up front. Seems like the bass is more up front and the drums are more up front. And I'm wondering why
Yeah.
if the bass and drums are more up front, because those are the two guys, who are listening to this stuff.
Yeah.
On the early Beatles stuff, Ringo always said, well, you could never hear the kick drum, and then when, the Sergeant Pepper um, reissue came out in 2017, Ringo was excited about it. I think he said it's like drum boogie. You can hear the drums everywhere, and so I wonder how much they had to do with that. it's interesting to hear the songs in a different setting and to hear elements that maybe you didn't hear before. As a longtime Beatles fan or a solo Beatles fan, I think people would find that very interesting. They might not like it as much as the original version, but it's interesting to hear nonetheless.
Yeah, I'm kind of torn between, I always loved the original mixes to begin with. Not that they were perfect, because I don't like vocals in one channel, lead vocals in one channel. I always think the lead vocal should be centered. But other than that, to say, I don't like when people might say that a new mix is the definitive version, But that being said, having popped Sergeant Pepper, the remix, in my car just recently, it sounded amazing
Yeah,
with such clarity that I never heard before. And man, if you never heard the bass before, it's so loud now,
yeah,
especially on
yeah,
with a little help from my friends. My God.
yeah. Bass and drums, and the same thing happened on Abbey Road. It was a beautiful sounding record before, but when you remaster it and do a little bit of tweaking to it, they didn't really make it sound all that different. They made it sound maybe a little bit better, but they didn't take away any of the original vibe or feel of the record.
Hmm. Well, that's the important thing. Sometimes I'm against changes in the balance of the mix. I'm all for clarity, you know. I'm all for remastering. Remixing is a whole different animal. So
Mm-hmm.
as long as
Yeah.
people look at it as a different way to listen, not this is the way you must listen from now on, I'm okay with it.
Well, you know what I would love to hear, and I don't know if we ever will, or maybe we will now that every other possible Beatles compilation has been exhausted. But when I was watching McCartney 321, and Paul and Rick Rubin were there at the mixing console, kind
Mm.
of fading tracks up and down. It would be cool to hear just the vocal tracks from certain songs and just the instrumental tracks from certain songs, because there was a portion, I think it was Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, where John totally went off key on one of his vocal lines, and you can't hear that in the finished version. But Paul kind of made a little jokey reference to it. I'm like, that's cool. I mean, it's just cool to hear stuff you maybe hadn't heard before,
Uh-huh.
and hearing just the vocals to Andrew Bird Can Sing,
Right.
and the instrumental bed, in two different ways as they did during that show. That was fascinating to me. I'd love to hear that kind of stuff. It just makes you hear the songs differently and appreciate the finished versions maybe even a little bit more.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with you. The big highlight for me in that documentary was Dear Prudence, when you really heard that sustained harmony from John,
Mm-hmm.
Paul, and George. That was amazing.
Yeah, yeah. The one thing I think George brought to the Beatles, well, he brought a lot, but I mean his greatest strength, I think, and one that gets overlooked, was his harmony singing. I mean, that three-part harmony on so many of those songs was just amazing. And he played obviously a big role in that. And I think maybe even more than his guitar playing, I think the fact that his harmonies were so spot on when he was singing with John and Paul, that was one of his main strengths as a musician.
I would agree, and very overlooked too. And
Yeah.
I actually I married into a musical family, and my wife and my son teach me quite a lot. And they've told me that when you're doing three-part harmony, the hardest part to sing is the middle part.
Mm-hmm.
And most of the time that was George.
Yeah. Yeah. Paul
So
was high, John was low. Yeah. Yeah.
it's one of the things we take for granted when it comes to George Harrison. So
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And yeah, it gets overlooked, and it really shouldn't, because I love watching and I'm sure you've seen this, and I'm sure a lot of your viewers have seen it as well. A little minute and a half clip of George watching the Beatles singing "This Boy"
on Ed Sullivan,
on the Ed Sullivan Show, and George is watching it. I think it was 1976,
that
and he's
was
kind of doing.
yeah, during Saturday Night Live backstage,
Yeah.
I think it was.
Okay. Yeah. So he's sort of, he's sort of singing along with the harmonies and woo, and you can just the look on his face. You could tell, for all the bad stuff that had gone down, he still got a kick out of watching the Beatles do what they did, and that song being a particular what made me think of it, that's a particular a harmonic exercise for them vocally,
Yeah.
which was a pretty amazing achievement back then.
It's such a magical moment when you got the three of them on the same microphone, like you
Yeah.
did on This Boy,
Yeah.
So before we go, one last question. This is not exactly what you would expect as a final question, because so many
Uh-oh.
things I want to ask you, because truthfully, this is no exaggeration. Every chapter here could be a show to itself, each album that we're talking about, if we want to go in detail. But
Mhm.
at the back of your book, you've got in the solo careers of the Beatles, your 10 favorite Paul songs, your 10 favorite George, 10 favorite Ringo, 5 songs from John that you said were under the radar. But the one song you picked from Paul that you said was your favorite was Junior's Farm.
Yes.
And I want to know
Yeah.
why.
Oh gosh, I just think it's a great single. It's got a very kinetic sort of sound to it. Um, it's got a wonderful guitar solo from Jimmy McCullough, which
Sure.
comes early in the song, which is a little different than most tunes. Um, the lyrics are pure McCartney, meaning they make very little sense, but they're fun to listen to and fun to sing along to. And it's one of his more rockin' tracks, I think, from that era, from the 70s. It's sort of, came out not long after Jet, and sort of reminds me of Jet a little bit, in that it's very kinetic, very, forward moving, and just, some great harmonies, or typically great Paul melody. And I think it's kind of one of his great lost singles, since it was never on an album at the time. And I'm not sure why it wasn't, but I would hear it a lot on the radio here, and I've loved it since 1974 when it was released. You can never get enough. Every time it's one of those songs, when it comes on the radio or wherever it comes on, I immediately turn it up. And,
I feel the same way.
Yeah,
One of
it's great.
One of the fun things about being a Beatle fan, between the Beatles and their solo stuff, were all these non-album singles. And they were a treat to have sometimes in between albums. And that's one that, there's so many singles Paul has put out that I love. I think Another Day was a perfect pop single, and
Mm-hmm.
Uncle Albert Halsey is a masterpiece. And I love, well, all the singles really. But Junior's Farm is one of those rare occurrences where I can hear that song every day and never get tired of it.
Yeah, same. Yeah, I feel exactly the same way. And it's really hard to pull off live. I've seen Paul do it, I think once, live, and of course did a wonderful job. But if you're a cover band, trying to pull it off live, it's difficult, because it has that dual guitar, two guitars playing that main riff that kicks off the song. And it's not easy. It's not an easy song to play, but it's really, really powerful, but still very poppy. Just classic McCartney. Love it.
Yeah, I'm glad that he brought it back into his set list in recent years. And it's probably very difficult to sing those high notes towards the end, the Take Me Back part. And the way the song ends with him taking a breath is just so cool. It's the
Yeah,
ultimate coolness.
yeah. Everything about that song is just perfect, and even I'm also a fan of the B-side. Sally G is a very cool, kind of countryish little ditty, which heard on the radio here in Los Angeles quite a bit at the time as well. And I hadn't heard it in a long time, but then I think it popped up on the Beatles channel on Sirius XM
Mhm.
the other day, and listened to it, and then came home and listened to it again, because I hadn't heard it in so long. I'm like, yeah, this is a really cool track.
It's a perfect song in terms of composition and in the way that it was produced. And Paul's vocals are just, I hate to keep using the word perfect, but it's just
Yeah.
everything about the arrangement. It's wonderful. And it's one of my favorite McCartney B-sides, really.
Mm-hmm.
Sally G.
Yeah, yeah, one of the best singles of the 70s, from any artist, I think. Not just the Beatles or solo Beatles.
I would agree. All right, so I want to remind everybody that John's new book is called The Beatles 100, 100 Pivotal Moments in Beatle History. His copy looks much better than my copy, but, and there are other lists, by the way, in this book. I'm not going to tell anybody what your favorite Beatles song is. I'll leave them hanging. They'll have to buy the book to find out. But I will
There
tell
you go.
you that it's not a typical song that you would expect. That is his favorite Beatles song. I love all the explanations why it's your favorite. Very well said. But yeah, 100 Pivotal Moments. It's a great book. I advise everybody to go get it. And John, this has been wonderful having you on. We'll have to have you on again. There's a lot of stuff I didn't cover. Like I said, we could talk about any chapter here. And it's every single one of these moments is very important to talk about.
Yeah. Well,
Indeed.
well, thanks so much for having me, Ken. It's been a blast, and always enjoyed chatting about the Beatles and solo Beatles with you. And yeah, just really appreciate it.
Yeah, and I want to remind everybody that I will post the link of an earlier interview that I did. It's strictly an audio interview where John's talking about the Imagine album and Ram as his two favorite albums from 1971. That's on my website. And I'm also going to post a link if you want to purchase autographed copies of the new book from John in my description box there. So thanks a lot to all of you for watching. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. And we'll see you next time.